This particular lecture is going to draw distinctions between some key terms that relate to general argumentation theory. The first distinction I want to draw is between the words persuasion and coercion. They're words that we use sometimes interchangeably, but in fact they are significantly different in terms of how they play out and how they are used to influence people. Basically, persuasion is an idea that involves perceived choice, that when I try to persuade you, I am attempting to get you to buy into what I'm talking about, but you ultimately perceive that you have the choice as to whether or not to do what I'm asking you to do. Whereas coercion, there is a perception of no choice. After I make my appeal, you feel like you have to do it, whether you want to or not, that I am essentially forcing you to do it. Therefore, the difference between the two is not necessarily choice as such, but the perception of choice. For example, let's say that you are walking down a city street. You decide for some crazy reason to take a detour into an alley that leads off the street. When you're walking down the alley, sort of like Bruce Wayne's parents, you confront somebody who has a gun, holds a gun in front of you and says, your money or your life. Okay? The message, your money or your life, the words, combined with the actions and the nonverbals of holding the gun and the menacing posture they assume, presents you with a certain message. That is a message intended to affect, change, transform, determine your behavior. The question then becomes, is that message one of persuasion or is it a message of coercion? If you perceive that you have absolutely no choice here, that you must give over the money, then we would consider it the message to be coercion. On the other hand, if you perceive you do have a choice, that you can decide whether or not you want to give over the money, it's perceived as a message of persuasion. Now, most of the time when I ask this question, most people in class will say, well, of course I have to give over the money, it's coercion. But there's always somebody who says, no, I'm not going to give up my money, I'm not going to give up my wallet, I don't think they'll really follow through on it. I don't think they'll really hurt me. I think I can face them down, I think I can fight them off. To that person, the message is persuasion. To the other people who think they have no choice, it is coercion. In other words, the difference between these two terms isn't determined as such by the content of the message. It's determined by the receiver as they respond to and interpret the message. Now, get a little more detailed. In persuasion, we say that the person who's offering the message has knowledge of the consequences, but not necessarily control over them. So, as a persuader, I know what will happen to you if you perform action A or action B, but I don't necessarily cause action A or action B to happen. Rather, I have knowledge of outcomes. Whereas in the coercion situation, I have control over the outcomes. Another charitable example. I'm a parent of a child. The child is going to go out and play outdoors. I know this child tends to misbehave. I know this child performs dangerous behavior. And so I say to my child on the way out the door, and don't go play in the street or a car might hit you. Okay? Is that coercion or persuasion? Well, the negative consequence here is the car hitting the child. I, as a parent, know that could happen. But I'm not actually going to run out to the garage, get in my car, run down my kid and go, see, I told you not to play in the street. So the parent is not the one causing the consequences, but the parent is knowledgeable of the consequences. Therefore, the message, don't go play in the street or you could get hit by a car, is a message of, most likely to be, a message of persuasion. Because the parent is aware of the consequences, but doesn't control or cause them. Whereas, if you had some dementoid parent who did jump in the car, go out in the street and smack down their own child to prove their point, then it would be a message of coercion, because the parent has control over the consequences. I know that's a macabre example. So for example, if we say politician is talking about trying to appeal to voters and saying, if you vote for me, I will vote in favor of the new housing law and we will improve housing in this city. In that case, the politician says, I will have control over the consequences, so voting for me as a person who can control consequences might be seen more as an act of coercion. On the other hand, if the politician says, vote for me because I will be part of the discussion and I know that if you don't vote for me, but rather vote for my opponent, if my opponent gets in there, here's how my opponent will vote. I have knowledge of what he or she will do, and therefore I can predict outcomes if you don't vote for me. In which case, it might move more toward persuasion. Hope that makes sense. Point is, it is in the mind of the recipient, not the mind of the speaker, as such, that determines the difference between persuasion and coercion. And a basic difference that helps you to decide whether or not you see it as coercion or persuasion is, do you perceive me as having control over the consequences? If you perceive that I do have control over the consequences, then you're more likely to perceive the situation as coercion. If you perceive that I do not have control over consequences, you're more likely to perceive the situation as persuasion. Okay, next distinction between them. In the situation of coercion, when I do have control over the consequences, I can offer you as the coercer one or both of two things. I can offer either promises or threats. Promises, not surprisingly, are where I say, if you do this thing I want you to do, I make a positive promise to you. I will make good things happen to you. For example, if you vote for me, I will go to Congress and I will pass this law to get more jobs for your district. Okay? I promise you I will do that. And I can make it happen. I have the power to. On the other hand, if you don't do what I want you to do, I make threats against you. If you do not give me a raise, I will come in and do something harmful to your business, or do something harmful to you, or not do my job the way I'm supposed to. But I have the power to deliver on that. So in a coercion situation, when I'm saying, I'm forcing you to do this, basically, and you perceive that I'm forcing you, you perceive that I'm forcing you because you think I have control over the outcomes, and I'm telling you what those outcomes will be that I can make happen, and I'm either promising you good things or threatening you with bad things. But I can make threats and promises because I can produce them. On the other hand, when we're dealing with persuasion, I no longer have control over the consequences, but I know what the consequences will be. So what I'm offering you are not promises and threats, but rather mendations and warnings. Mendation is like the word recommendation. I recommend to you that this happen. And what I'm saying is, this is something good that will happen. I'm not going to make it happen, but I know it will follow if you do the thing I'm suggesting that you do. Whereas a warning is exactly the opposite. I am warning you of bad things that will happen if you don't do what I want you to do, or I'm warning you of bad things that I'll make happen to you if you don't give in to what I'm asking for. Because I know the consequences. Down here, I control the consequences. I promise good things. I threaten bad things. Up here, I have knowledge of what the consequences will be, so I make mendations to you, tell you about good things you can expect, or I offer you warnings, tell you about bad things you can expect. Thus, the parent who says to the child, don't run out into the street because a car will hit you, we would normally consider that an act of persuasion, because the parent, while they're not going to be driving that car, knows that there's a real risk of the car hitting the child, and so is warning you against getting hit by the truck. Okay, apply it to the classroom for a second. As I say to you, go study for this exam, because if you study, you'll get a good grade. And if you don't study, you're going to probably get a bad grade. Okay? Do you perceive that as an act of coercion or an act of persuasion? The question becomes, do you perceive that I have control over the consequences? If you think that I can give you any grade I feel like giving you regardless of your performance, then you would perceive that as a threat or a promise, because I can make the grade happen. On the other hand, if you perceive that I'm simply saying, I'm going to grade the answers that are there, and you either have the knowledge written down or not, you check the right box or not, you fill in the right blank or not, and therefore, I know from my experience that people who don't study tend not to be able to check the right box or not mark down the right letter. And I know from my experience that people who do study tend to get these answers correct. Then all I'm doing is persuading you. I won't make the grade be good or bad, but I'm aware of what the grade is likely to be, i.e. what the answers are likely to be, based on whether or not you study. So one person might perceive me as offering an act of coercion. One person might perceive me as offering an act of persuasion in the same situation. Going back to the robber example for a minute, if you perceive that I, as a robber in the alleyway, will pull the trigger or can cause harm to you, then you perceive me as coercion because I have control over making negative consequences happen, or a promise, I'll let you go free. On the other hand, if you perceive that I don't have control, you have control because you can disarm me or you can fight back or you can call the police or something else, then I don't have control of the situation anymore. I just have some knowledge about it, and so you don't have to accept my warnings or mendations. Do you have any questions on that? Okay. I realize that as you watch this on tape, you can't answer that, but I'm talking to the people who are here to see if they have any questions at all over any of it. Do you think it's clear enough? Okay. That's the end of our discussion of warnings versus mendations and promises versus threats, i.e. the difference between persuasion and coercion. And I think we'll stop this particular tape there and say that's a self-contained capsule separating those two